Who knew bringing people manure would bring such joy?
Just being smart about things and not wasting things.
This technology goes back about 500 billion years.
Everybody is kind of catching up with Act 148.
I really think people here are ready to do this work. They really just need somebody to actually give them the credit that they might actually care about what their world looks like.
This episode, we're talking about waste. We're here at a transfer station in Williston, Vermont, where Vermont trash gets packed and then shipped off to the landfill. But what if I told you that not all of this waste needs to be wasted? Now, stay with me here. When we hear the word waste, we think of something that has no value. But a lot of the food that we throw out has some very real value. Unharvested food from the fields can be gathered and delivered to those in need. Food scraps from our cafeterias can be fed to livestock or composted. And some of this so-called waste can even generate energy. There is real value, biological and economic, in a lot of the leftovers and byproducts of our food stream. So this episode, let's not talk about waste. Let's talk about nutrient management. Better yet, let's talk about resource management. And let's talk about those wonderful people who are coming up with innovative ways to get this value back into our local food system.
With Act 148, I think that this type of facility and this type of community facility is going to be really, really important.
Act 148 is a mandate that these organics may not be in landfill.
When the bill came out, it really was a collaboration of years and years of study all coming back together and what makes sense, what not makes sense.
Act 148, the state's universal recycling law, is going to change the way that we deal with everything we used to call waste. Obviously, the Agency of Natural Resources is going to have a lot to do with the implementation of this law. We met with Bryn Oakleaf at her offices in Montpelier to talk about the state's best practices for resource management.
My name is Bryn Oakleaf. I work with the Agency of Natural Resources. I'm an environmental analyst working on implementation of the Universal Recycling Law.
Recycling? Isn't that beer bottles and yogurt containers? What does this have to do with food?
As it relates to the food system, the Universal Recycling Law has disposal bans on food waste, and with that law we also have adopted the food recovery hierarchy, which sets out priority of management of the usable food and the nutrients that they have in order to get them out of the landfill and into a system that can best utilize them. We, as the state of Vermont, are the only state in the nation that have adopted the food recovery hierarchy into our law.
In this episode, we'll go through and show examples of each step in this food resource hierarchy, and how Vermonters are coming up with increasingly innovative ways to prevent our waste from being wasted.
There's over 60,000 tons of food that's going to our landfill.
60,000 tons? That's a whole lot of food scraps. What should we be doing with all that? And how can we change our ways and keep it out of the landfills?
These are your options. You need to either compost them or send them to anaerobic digestion, but they can no longer go to the landfill. They have too much value and they have too much of a negative effect on our environment.
People go, oh, how much is this going to cost me? What kind of hassle will this be? How am I going to do this?
It's a new system that hasn't really been in place in Vermont.
What we'll find is at first we'll not be as efficient. The more and more we do it, we'll get technologies to make us more efficient, and then eventually the cost will be less than landfilling.
Tom Moreau has dedicated his career to what other people throw away.
I'm Tom Moreau, General Manager of Chittenden Solid Waste District. We happen to be at the Casella Transfer Station on Avenue B in Williston.
As Vermont's largest solid waste district, CSWD is really going to be affected by Act 148.
And it was drafted with a lot from CSWD staff. We had a lot of input into that bill, and therefore we had a lot of engagement with what I'd call the enviros, the real pro-environment people, the business community, because it's going to impact them, as well as we had a lot of impact with the haulers. How is this going to affect you? So the law's designed so we'll get all the business and commercial food waste first, and then we'll kick in to the residential.
We want to make sure that it's very little change from what families are already doing.
But I bet it's going to cost us taxpayers more money, right?
The vast majority of the customer's bill is in the collection process. Going out and collecting it, very heavy material and not good root density, therefore the collection cost tends to be higher.
The additional option is the curbside collection. So that will be offered by haulers beginning in 2017.
The really full cost of doing something and doing it right sometimes costs more in a price, but you gain so many externalities that it's really worth doing it. And that's everything from energy to building soils to just being smart about things and not wasting things.
We're looking at where our gaps are, where the infrastructural needs are at each level of the food recovery hierarchy, and injecting some capital funding to assist with that, to smooth out those roadblocks and get these materials, get these valuable nutrients into systems that can use them.
My wife laughs at, all you've done your entire career is take people's crap and garbage. And I go, yep, that's what I've done for my entire life. You know, I was a chemist. That was my major in college. And I understand it. And, you know, it's been kind of a neat thing to try to be that interface between the science and society. You know, what's the science say? And if it says, hey, not using something efficiently is not good, and you can mathematically prove that and go to those points, then it's just, how do we then turn that into a policy? And then how do we build the infrastructure and the system to do that?
We're talking about resources. We're talking about our natural resources, saving energy, reducing greenhouse gases, and benefiting our economics while doing that, and our communities at the same time.
Some food, for one reason or another, just isn't suitable for sale, like this apple.
30 to 40% of our food that is grown from farm to plate is wasted. So the problem isn't a need for more food. The challenge and opportunity that go hand in hand is capturing that surplus food and getting it into a system that can redistribute that to those that need it.
My name is Teresa Snow. I work for Salvation Farms. I'm the founding director.
Teresa Snow from Salvation Farms has some big ideas about how to use the food that gets left behind on fields when farmers harvest for market. And she won't let us call it waste.
We're really inspired by the opportunity to manage an available resource.
Because while this food isn't perfect, it's perfectly good, and it can go to feed Vermonters in need. The practice of gleaning, or capturing food left in the fields, goes back almost as far as agriculture itself.
And what gleaning is the reaping after the harvest. It's an ancient agrarian activity, typically done by the poor and traveler, but more modernly coordinated by the host organization or agency.
And Teresa has some ideas about how gleaned food can totally change the landscape of local food in Vermont.
Quality food that isn't making it to market, keeping it from being lost at that point of production, and getting it into sites like charitable and institutional meal programs that aren't going to directly impact the farm and their markets in a negative way. So Salvation Farms really worked on building a professional, efficient, effective, replicable model for community-based gleaning. We're going to need to have a system and mechanisms for aggregating, cleaning, quality assessing, case packing food raw, as well as minimally processing.
Folks like Teresa get the food to people in need. Now what happens if that food gets tossed in the compost? Can we somehow get it to farm animals? Let's find out.
My name's Tom Gilbert, and you're at Black Dirt Farm in Standard, Vermont.
While the big guys are trying to figure out what to do with food scraps on a statewide level, Tom Gilbert is showing us how to close the loop on his very own property.
If you look at any natural ecosystem that's not managed by human beings, it has to be a looped system in some capacity. You have to take resources from the living side of the equation and pass it through the decomposer system to nourish that living side of the equation again, and so life and death have to be in balance.
Tom collects food scraps from all over the Northeast Kingdom and brings them back to his own Black Dirt Farm.
We pick up from about 50 different businesses throughout the week, collecting about 25 tons of material in 48-gallon containers.
Where he can feed them to chickens.
Bring about 25% back to the farm here to feed our laying hens.
Create rich compost and even worm castings that he can sell all over the state. We talked to Tom about why this is compelling and why it even grabbed the interest of the USDA.
We have a USDA SARE grant, which is a small branch of the USDA, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, comparing feeding food scraps in a compost mix to laying hens versus feeding organic grain to laying hens. Probably our biggest difference is yolk color. We get a really, really nice bright orange yolk, and with the compost, and the hens on the grain have pretty anemic, yellow yolks, where we're really growing bacteria and fungi for the hens to feed on. They are eating that food, but we're feeding them more than that. So they take a bite of an apple, that piece of apple is sheathed with thousands of bacteria, and that's where a lot of the protein is coming from. Running a rig around collecting the material is really more to support our farming operation than anything else. But as we build the farm, it's also a nice piece of the cash flow.
Cash flow? You mean there's money to be made from this garbage?
We come in and provide a parallel service to trash, and the business pays us instead of paying somebody who's going to take it to landfill. We just operate as a hauler in that relationship.
This is pretty spectacular for a small farm. But could you actually apply this on a larger scale across the state?
Absolutely. My estimates are we could feed 500,000 laying hens with a system like this. To me, community composting systems are just like local food. It's the same exact thing. Really, the question should be, is the resource value staying in the community? Is the dollar staying in the community? Is the nitrogen staying in the community? And one of my greatest concerns for Vermont is that we will not steward the resource that food scraps are, and that we will be sloppy in our implementation of the Universal Recycling Act and tolerate contamination of that material. Dr. King once said, if you stand in the middle of the road, you can get hit by a car. Well, I think that sounds like pretty sage advice myself. So, I think half steps are actually dangerous. I think you take a full measure and you get to where you want to go.
Here's the worst thing about this business. This is what makes me the most unhappy, is all the plastic.
Talk to anyone in Vermont farming about compost, and eventually they're going to quote Carl Hammer.
I think it's fair to say that we don't make soil. We participate in a mystery. What's happening in soil is complex beyond our structural capability.
Carl started the Vermont Compost Company in the early 1990s, and the company has changed a lot since its early days.
I started with a team of mules and 5-gallon pails.
Carl used to drive a mule-drawn cart in downtown Montpelier for food scrap pickups and potting soil drops. Today, the company ships its finished product all over the country.
It's a lot of plants in greenhouses, all growing in the same media that came from this little hillside with all of its geologic, biologic specificity, all the way out in Iowa. The germinative event for tomato is happening in this Vermont compost.
And consider that he can tell good compost from bad compost by smelling it like some other people might smell a Cabernet.
For me, it's very olfactory. Each of the biocommunities involved in the process has odor signature. And some people can smell it and some can't. So sometimes we'll reject the compost and send it back to school because the odor's off.
We spent an afternoon with Carl at his Main Street compost farm in Montpelier to learn a little more about it.
Very early on, I started making potting soil and selling it to farmers. And I've got customers in Vermont who've been buying potting soil from me since 1988. And they buy a lot.
If business has been so good for Carl, why aren't more dirt lovers getting in the compost game?
The business is a very thin margin business. It requires a certain amount of land and capital. The regulatory environment is somewhat murky, and profitability could be elusive. There's no smart money investing in composting in Vermont. It's only kind of demented money, or determined money, idealist money. This business funded itself by doing it. So it didn't start with money. It started with work, and we did work, and we've done a lot of things. We did a lot of years where we were composting wasted ruined ice cream for Ben & Jerry's. I literally bought the farm in '96 on plumbing emergencies at various Ben & Jerry's plants. It was one of the most profitable years of my life, 1996.
Why bother with all this soil chemistry? Isn't dirt just dirt, whether it comes from compost or not?
Management of soils is something humans have done for quite a long time and done pretty badly. Anytime you open plow ground, a lot of carbon is combusted. So soils lose carbon when there's tillage happening. More than half of anthropogenic CO2 came from soil abuse over the last 10,000 years, and less than half is from fossil combustion. Now we sit poised to become 9 billion people that need to eat from the same finite resource. the only mechanism that could draw down enough atmospheric carbon dioxide and put it in stable structures are plants and fungus sequestering liquid carbon as complex polysaccharides in soil. That will increase the productivity of soils. I wandered wide of your question, perhaps?
A little out there, perhaps. But tell me, Carl, what makes your compost soil so special?
Compost has the capacity to take totally lifeless soil aggregate matrix like sand or stone dust and turn it into usable soil. Yeah, well, it's as close to magic as anything else. Compost did that.
If you want to know about the future of local food in Vermont, heck, maybe the future of local food, period, you should visit Vermont Tech. Few other places have all the steps of the food system laid out so plainly on one stretch of land as they do.
It's a perfect closed loop system.
They grow the food, they teach classes on how to process it, they cook it for their dining halls, they sell it to the community, and then, and this is crucial, they gather up all of the leftovers and byproducts and other things from their food system, put it into this machine, which churns out incredibly rich fertilizer, and, get this, generates electricity.
We take in waste, we create energy, we generate revenue.
And yes, that really is as impressive as it sounds.
I'm Mary O'Leary. I'm the chair of the Civil and Environmental Engineering Technology Department here at Vermont Tech, and I'm an associate professor. All of the material that we use for anaerobic digestion comes into the central bay. The manure trucks, for example, back right up and dump into our mixing pit, which is right here. It's 15,000 gallons underground, under concrete right here. All of this gets mixed and then gets sent out to the hydrolyzer. That's where the aerobic process starts. We get the breakdown of all the material that we're putting in there. That gets moved over to our bigger tank, which is the actual digester itself. That's anaerobic, so no oxygen. It's like our stomach. We digest everything in there. It creates methane, and it's captured in a balloon. And all that gas then goes into the building, and we have a genset, a generating engine, and that turns it into electricity and heat. We need to feed it about 16,000 gallons a day. So it's a pretty hefty machine.
This seems pretty successful, Mary. Could this system take all of the state's compost and turn it into energy?
That is certainly one of our goals, and has been our goals from the beginning of this project, was to figure out how this could be scalable, because this costs $4.5 million to build this, and that is not something that everybody is going to be able to do. Regionally based facilities like this, community based, where a community provides the waste materials that feed something like this and then takes advantage of the waste from this, the heat and the electricity and the nutrients, takes advantage of it. I think that will make sense and that is scalable, but I certainly think that is probably more feasible than individual farmers trying to manage something like this.
Terrific. Is anybody else in the Green Mountain State using a digester?
Farmers across Vermont who have smaller digesters, not like ours. They have generally plug flow digesters.
The one we have is an anaerobic plug flow digester.
They feed theirs almost entirely manure, which works for them. You know, they put it back into their, to heat their farms or to heat the farm buildings or provide electricity.
It produces enough biogas to run a 225 kilowatt generator.
They can't take as much as we can, and they can't mix it as well, unfortunately, with the plug flow digester.
Matt Maxwell, tell us how you got your digester.
It was a $2.1 million project. It was like, you know, it was the perfect storm of grants and stuff to help fund this thing.
Nice. Show us how this bad boy works.
You need lots of cows to produce lots of manure in order to make methane, in order to produce electricity. 6 cows equals 1 kilowatt of electricity. So all of the manure from this barn and the other milking barn is pushed by hydraulic alley scrapers. It flows down these slits at the end of the barn where gravity flows into a receiving area right over here. So the receiving area is where the manure from these 2 barns is collected and then pumped into the digester. It's actually being pumped in right now as we speak. There's an agitator in here which stirs up all the manure, makes sure it's nice and frothy and liquidy so it'll pump nice and easy. Over on this side is another concrete tank in the ground. These are organic fats, greases, and oils from a food processing facility. So we mix in a little bit of that every day. It gets pumped into this bunker-looking thing over here, which is the actual digester. This new manure that's getting pumped in right now, it's entering in this back corner. In about 3 weeks, it's going to be right over here. And over here is a pump where we pump the manure from the digester into a separating unit, which is a large screw press. We squeeze all of the liquid out of the manure. The liquid flows back to our lagoon, which is right over here, where we field apply it for fertilizer. And the solids we collect and use them to bed our cows in the place of sawdust. It's dried manure solid. It's like a peat moss type substance. It's got a variety of uses. Landscaping companies buy it as a soil amendment. Gardeners use it to mix in with their soil. We use a lot of it in our greenhouse, as a soil amendment. Very good for growing vegetables.
Cool. So we took care of food rescue, composting, and digesters. What's next up on the hierarchy? Well, compost heat recovery. How does this process happen?
I'm Brian Jaros. I'm a co-founder and the president of AgriLab Technologies.
Have you ever stood next to a big pile of compost? Let me tell you, you can feel the heat.
I always was amazed by how much heat would come off of a really well-functioning compost pile. You can have 150 degrees, sometimes even hotter.
And that's thanks to the bacteria. In the pile, the bacteria start doing their work and they create heat. And as the pile heats up, they die and are replaced by other bacteria. More heat, other bacteria. And the piles can get as hot as 150 degrees.
That energy is just going up into the air.
Now, you may already be thinking, what if we could capture some of that heat, which typically just floats off into the air, and put it to some use, warming a cow barn or even a farmhouse? Brian Jaros of AgriLab Tech is doing just that.
15 years ago, I started doing some research into systems that are able to recover energy and found mostly they're at a very basic scale and none had been commercialized. I had the opportunity at this farm, Terry and Joanne Magnan's farm, Diamond Hill Custom Heifers, to build the first large-scale project in Vermont where we were able to capture this thermal energy and save them $10,000 a year in heating costs for their hot water and heating some of their facilities.
Very efficient system. I mean, we're talking about running a quarter horsepower motor, to get 160 degree water. It's, that's pretty hard to beat.
Our process works by using aeration systems to draw the vapor. So it's suction, it's called negative aeration. We draw it into ductwork over specialized heat exchangers, and then we're able to capture useful hot water. At other farms, and I think even more related to the food systems, is heating greenhouses. So that's about the part that's exciting about extending the growing season either in the winter or the late fall by using a renewable resource, just something that you need to be managing anyways, your materials for compost, to be able to use energy from that resource to run greenhouses and not have to use more fossil fuel, more other artificial inputs. You actually need a pretty big pile of compost to make this viable. It's not for your backyard compost pile. You're not going to be heating your house with your kitchen scraps. But that being said, there's hundreds of farms in Vermont. There's over 20 commercial composting sites. They're all of sufficient scale, at least with the technology we have right now, to recover useful heat. When the manure is brought in, it gets loaded onto these channels. There's 16 troughs down into the floor that are put on that vacuum suction or negative aeration to draw air and the hot steamy vapor down through. These lines go under those troughs in the floor. They provide the suction or the vacuum up through the fan, and then that long, what's actually a 50-foot culvert has a series of pipes inside. That's where all that steamy 150-degree vapor condenses on. There's a heat transfer mechanism inside. It's a refrigerant, but it wicks it up to the steel tank at the other end, 800 gallons of water, and releases the heat into that tank. And then that tank is like a solar hot water tank or any other, where it's tied into the rest of the plumbing, goes into the radiant floor, used for hot water, washing, and so forth. A big accomplishment in my mind. Who knew bringing people manure would bring such joy.
In this episode, we saw a lot of productive uses for food that was otherwise going to be tossed aside as waste. And hopefully, you'll remember some of those resources the next time you go to clear your plate. Because if there's one thing we've learned from this trip through the food system, it's that every step is connected. As soon as our food starts growing in the ground, there's value to be preserved, from fields to trucks to forks to the waste stream and right back into the field again. And Vermont is painting an impressive picture of what's possible when we collaborate. And although we may be a tiny part of a much larger global food system, the innovations we have here at home can go to help the country and maybe even the world solve the common problems we face in our food systems. We hope you enjoyed taking a ride on the locomotive with us. Now get out there and eat.
This is what I want to say to everybody, is this global warming stuff, this carbon accumulating in the sky is a tremendous opportunity for our future. And right now, the only business that I'm aware of that takes carbon out of the atmosphere is farming. The only business that is going to solve global warming is agriculture.
Hey, he's at the dump. Hey, he's at the dump.
It's really clear that our Agency of Agriculture, our statewide entities, our little local farmers, our technical service providers are all pulling towards the same big goal. So it allows us to have really creative projects.
Production of the locomotive is supported in part by Ben & Jerry's, City Market, Gardner's Supply Company, Hanover Co-op Food Stores, Hickok and Boardman Insurance Group, Price Chopper, UVM Dining, the Vermont Community Foundation, Vermont Farm to Plate Network, VSECU, and by viewers like you.